Welcome to Spiritual Studies Session 65. This is a unique addition to the course because it doesn't take on the sort of model that many do. Some might be familiar with the focus subjects that that labor to dig up as much as possible in the way of comparative religion, in the way of culture, in the way of spiritual understanding of either long lost or contemporary religious traditions. And then there's a fair amount that are dedicated towards a certain aim or towards a certain point. This session is taking these names, Heka, Hecate, Ptah, and the Demiurge, and is following those ways. So the mutual themes throughout this is that, for one, this is an extension to the alchemy unit and the spiritual energy session in giving some more voice to the Egyptian Heka, and then discussing how that goes into the concept of Hecate and the change that happens when we work with an idea and we cross it across time and culture. Then there's also this addition, which takes up a good majority of the session, with Ptah and what becomes the Demiurge. This is more along the lines of the creator, the idea of the creator and how that ultimately changed into what those to who recognizes the Demiurge in its place within Gnostic cosmology. So, without belaboring on too much context, I just want to say this is more about a journey than a destination. There are several interesting leads and synchronicities to pick up along the way, very poignant and interesting points to realize. So anyway, let's get started. We start with Hecate. And so, to dig back into Egypt and instead discuss Heka as a start. Heka appears in the coffin texts, which were written allegedly around 2134 BCE to 2040 BCE. And the quote goes as such: "To me belonged the universe before you gods came into being. You have come afterwards because I am Heka." Heka has no parentage, has no origin story, and has always been in the fabric of existence within these creation stories. So when a creator appears in the various creation stories of the Egyptians, you can always assume that Heka was already there. So in this way, too, what part does Heka play in the creation? Well, there is a way of breaking down Heka into different concepts. That is Heka, Sia, and Hu. These different aspects would ultimately come to not just aid creation, but also maintain the physical and metaphysical spiritual worlds, but also all forms of creation, thus life, and all forms of destruction, thus death. And at the beginning of time, as one story is, you have that god Atom emerging from the waters of chaos and standing on the first dry land, the Ben, as it's put, to begin creation. Where does this energy, where does this potential for creation come from? Atom pulls from Heka, the power that was drawn upon. Heka is synonymous with the word magic, and thus we can introduce this concept into the course, long withholden. A divine force which existed in the universe, which could be likened to chi, or prana, or mana, or wakan, however you wish to define. This particular hieroglyphic of Heka means power, the ability to sway things, force, right? A force acts upon the world. So the first work would be an act of force, right? Would be an act of power or strength, thus pulling from Heka. And when we say Ka there, notice it's the Lord of Kas, which is Ka, Ki, Chi. Perhaps, that might be a bit of a spin from me. The Ka is one of the 9 parts of the soul when it came to the Egyptian beliefs, the magical theory. The astral self is one way that we could put what Ka is. The Ba is the intermediary between the heavens and the earth, often viewed as a human-headed bird. And then there is the Ankh, which is the immortal soul. And of course, with the very sophisticated rituals of what would be done to those after death, it was to ultimately solicit this eternal, immortal self in its own passage to separate it from these other, let's just say, parts of the soul. Ka would have been the origin of the soul, would have been the power to distinguish it and to push it forward into existence. The giving of one's soul, the giving of one's power, energy, that which allows it to express itself not just in life, but in the afterlife. This coming from Heka. Heka, therefore, is related to all the creative aspects. Now, when I was distinguishing Sia, Hu, and Heka, Hu, and Heka, these are different parts of the body that represent the functions of Heka. So, the heart being thought of as the seat of the soul to this society, and that where personality, individuality, thought, and feeling originate, which, if we want to even contextualize this for the modern day more, you might say that your thoughts are all in your head and that your decisions are a matter of logic. But the impetus behind decision making, the impetus behind attention, is an emotive one. And if emotiveness, you would proclaim, is a heart-centric thing, thus the heart is the center of one's thoughts. Right? Stretch. Anyway, Sia is the personification of this heart, the seat of the soul, and Hu is the tongue. Heka is the power of both. So it's a overarching power of both of these things. So in the heart, one has an idea, one has an impulse, one has a motivation. That is not actualized. That is not manifested. But you can display it thanks to the power of Hu, thanks to the tongue, the intellectual powers moving from creation through the self and ultimately coming into existence through the word. And by means of this breath, can come to be. Sia, this heart power of perception and insight, is also the seat of what allows individuals to visualize anything. If I say donkey, you can get a donkey in your mind, right? If I say peanuts, you can imagine that. You visualize it. How are you doing that? How can you do that? How can you visualize these things that I'm saying? What is that? How do you care to explain that? This is what is called Sia. Hu, then, is this authoritative aspect, that which brings it to be, or allows its introduction into the external world beyond the internal seat of the soul. And again, all of this, all of the power of which comes from thoughts and commands, are the reality instilled by Heka. So when the Creator is said to speak the word, right, in all these different creation stories, we get the word or the breath of Brahman or what have you. You can see how this concept is interlaced, fundamental to even that act, the thought and the word. Ooh. So by the interplay of these faculties, Heka, Siya, Hu, in humans, this is what allows the thinking, the feeling, and the expression of oneself over the earth. And this is what is thought of as divine, as a distinguishing mark of humankind, and as, this microcosmic embodiment of that which is done macrocosmically by the deities. One of the ways that you can contextualize this use is by the word magic. And such is a trope of studying, Egypt and ancient Egypt, is how magic in this understanding, just as I've given it to you, is so fundamentally interlaced in the everyday affairs of the people. And again, we're talking ancient religion, so it's all the more pertinent to say that everyday affairs and everything that you do in some way informs spirituality, or the reverse case, right? Spirituality, beliefs, traditions, stories, understandings of the metaphysical universe inform everything you do. Even the act of preparing food is a sort of witchcraft if you consider it in all of its actions, right? You have the herbology, you have the ceremonious gathering of these different creatures and species, flora and anima, and collect their flesh, right? Decorate it with a little basil. These things are, again, by this conception, by this ancient conception of Egypt as an extension of Heka, an extension of the everyday magic of which we participate in order to solicit further life. So this act of trying to emulate magic as much as possible in everyday affairs, right? Like the reasons for one's sleep, the reasons for one's awaking, the reasons for one's attitudes, the reasons behind, right? All of these things could be interpretable through this lens, and thus, since magic is this all-pervasive aspect, then of course it lends itself to the opus of all religious understandings, which is medicine, which is the curing of diseases. And thus you have the priests of Heka, or what you might call doctors, involving themselves in the powers toward cure, to infuse energy or whatever particular ailment through herbology, through green witchcraft, through imbibing certain substances with intentionality. All of these things as thought of as a working with this all-pervading coercive power. You don't get something without giving something. That kind of stuff. And of course it would work in this mindedness. Of course it would, because it is that which has been before anything has been. This wholly significant aspect of medicinal practice, a medical practice of all manner of physiology, how the body is put together. And as we saw in prana, it was believed that the body's own architecture, its own interplay of openings and closings, is by the conduits of prana, meaning that of course you have two ears on both sides, of course you have a nose like that. All these things are the perfect vessel to maintain the flow of prana, generative power. Whew. So when it comes to the embodiment of Heka, this anthropomorphic form, because again, this is something incorporeal, this is a very lofty idea, but if you're put to try to put an image to this, what does it look like to them? And this is a man in a royal dress wearing a regal beard, which is curved, always carrying a staff with two serpents. And of course, we already know that this goes down to Greece via Asclepius. And the caduceus, still to this day, go look at any ambulance, go look at any hospital, and you will find the caduceus. It's all back here in Heka. This particular caduceus symbol may be traced back, because it's not to say that this is its origin, but it may be traced back to Nizazu, which is a Mesopotamian Sumerian deity that had its predominance over Energur. That is not too far from by the way. And Nizazu was known as the water knower. Very curious, because what is that water that they know? Is this the primordial etheric water, the prima materia that all comes forth from? Is the water the Abzu, which would be their tradition, or the Nun, as it is to the Egyptians? This is also known as an underworld deity, which is a reference that will come up with Hecate. Although the exact nature of this character, the functions, the persona, the beings of this character are not very well fleshed out with what has been dug up of this character. However, it is known, at least in one story, that he is believed to be the son of Ereshkigal, the goddess of the underworld, which is a whole nother thing to get into. Has had some limelight in the course before. In another tradition, the son of Enlil and Ninlil. Moving on. Now we have Hecate. And obviously there is a swap of sex here. However, when it comes to the confusing nature of this character, of this personified deity, we're going to see that that is very similar. Because if you consider even just the theogony as a canon, right, as something canonical to the Greek polytheism, then we would say that Hecate is the daughter of Perseus and Asteria. However, provided that canonical, anything canonical in the Greek way is not a very accurate display, then we also say that Hecate was created purely from Nyx, purely from Demeter and Zeus, purely from Hera and Zeus. If we were listening to the Orphics, then it would be Deo, the daughter of Dio, which is either Rhea or Demeter, or was soulfully created by Tartarus. These are all different accounts as to the origin within their polytheism of Hecate. Now, as it's more colloquially known, Hecate is recognized as the goddess of magic, witchcraft, and the underworld, all things of which we have heard plenty about already. Portrayed, though, as kind and helpful, although the menacing aspects seem to be there. Also considered a virgin goddess, much in the same way as Artemis and Athena. So in this way, we can already see that Hecate is difficult to define by looking at the source materials. She does not appear in the Homeric epics. There is certain scholars that would point to the Carians of the Asian Minor when it comes to where Hecate came from. You can already guess where my allegiances go on that subject. However, when she appeared ubiquitous, like a wildfire that caught across ancient Greece, because you find these different Hekatos, these different sculptures, Hekatolion, across the ancient world. We'll get to that in a bit. First, we should say the names: Hecate, Hekatos, the one who works from afar, regardless of distance. Of course, the true etymology is contended of this name, Heka Hecate, Hecate. Also a chthonic deity, meaning the underworld, meaning magic in witchcraft. Nyctopolos, she who wanders at night. Skylactegites, which is the goddess of crossroads, the leader of dogs. So here's where we get to bring that up again, because reoccurrently, dogs are the guardian of the afterlife. Those who guard the dead, the dogs. As we saw recently with the Taino, as we know with the Mayan, and as we know with the Greeks, Cerberus. What is often undermentioned is that these private rituals to Hecate were to involve the slaughtering of a dog to give to Hecate as an act of solidarity. That is where the interpretation of the sinisterness comes in, whereas this is not taboo to ancient society. Sacrifice, which is something that certainly would warrant its own sessions in the future. There's also Enodia, which is she of the road, the one who helps those along the road. The road, as this great allegory hints back to the Dharma talk. There's also the Soteria, or the Sotera, which is the savior. That's quite a lofty title, given retrospect. Also, she is called Antelos, which means tender. She is also called Phosphoros, bringer of light, and Kortropos, which is the nurse of the young, which might be a reference to dig it back to the primordial goddess, because already we may know that she tends to take on this triple Hecate figure, the triple goddess, maiden, mother, crone, which I'm going to say, if we're talking about a triple again, might we say Sia, Hu, and Heka? Maybe something to this effect, the triple form, the power of the triple. And in which case, if it's maiden, mother, crone, maybe it's something that's beyond all those forms, that give way to all those forms, as the woman is creation, the process of creation coming from Hecate. So in the 7th century, she was very not involved with the underworld in witchcraft. That changed. Hecate is, by Hesiod, praised as Kronos' honored above all. So Kronos, above all other deities, honors and praises Hecate. So what would Father Time be so interested in? Hecate would have a share of not just the earth, but also the sky, and would be involved to all mortals, all. So a tremendous list is given by Hesiod of all the different types of people, which are essentially all that Hecate helps. 5th century, all of a sudden Hecate is much darker, though sometimes helpful. Still retains it. Still described as a friendly virgin, primarily becoming now witchcraft, the night, and the underworld, thus where this association with Nyx comes in. And why this happens, why this change in character, is a mystery. They don't know why. By 430 BCE, just before this, was when she picked up these triplicate appearances, picking up the 3 faces and the 3 bodies. And again, maiden, mother, crone is my take. This goddess of the crossroads as well is interpreted by scholars as the reason for that triple form. No matter what path you walk, Hecate walks with, or can look over your way. This popularity of Hecate would be to be a blessing to travelers and the blessing to those entering any place, because Hecate represents the liminal spaces between entrances, between coming and going. So when you enter a house, it is an entrance. Entrance. So that difference between that outside reality and that inside reality, those two different trances, that transition between trances, is Hecate, the liminal, the thin place, as Fitzgerald put it. So when it would come to paths and traveling, there is a cusp, right? There's a cusp of entering a new forest. There is a cusp of entering the beginnings of the mountains. These are thin places, places of liminality. Also, metaphysically, the state between dreaming and waking, the state between living and dying, and thus the association with the dogs, that Hecate would be the one to help you down the road into the afterlife. As the dogs guard the dead, Hecate blesses them as they go. There's also this identification with this polos, which is this cylindrical crown and torch that you can often see her wearing. If these dogs of yours started barking in the night, the ancient Greeks would say that is Hecate passing, wandering through. The souls of the dead, an entourage of the souls of the dead around her, most notably the women, the girls who have died without giving birth and without ever having been married. In the ancient stories that are recognizable to most people, she plays more subtle roles. Hecate sided against the giants in the war with the Olympians, and she brought and fought with her torches. When Persephone was abducted by Hades, who is the only one who can hear her cries? Across any distance, who can hear her cries? Hecate does. Hecate does. Patron goddess of the witches, patron goddess throughout, right? Not just with the Greeks, but onto Roman literature. There is also the fact that Medea, the witch that helps Jason in the story of the Argonauts, is a complete and utter devotee to Hecate. And why would a witch be such a devotee to Hecate? Well, that's all the energy. That's all the magic. That's all the liminal. If you want to make something change, it has to go through a liminal space. It has to transition into a different thing. There are several temples. The most notable one is in Asia Minor, in Lagina. I think I'm saying that correctly. It was great, full of great marble statues, and within a courtyard run by not just priests, but also priestesses and eunuchs, all very busied. And there was also an homage to Hecate, Hecate of the Ramparts, in front of the entrance to the Acropolis, of course. So these associations with magic is also why it has carried so adamantly onto, into interest of the neo-pagan movements, right? This dealing with spells and curses, and also the magic papyri that would name Hecate. Interestingly enough, there is a text from Egypt made anywhere between 400 to 100 CE that has spells and formulas that name Hecate. But of course, she's not the only one. Chthonic or underworld deities are often the trope of these figures, being with their dealings of the afterlife in Hades. Selene and Persephone are no exception. Hecate involved in the cursed tablets when they were written as well. again, pulling from this Chthonian god to punish people or an enemy, but again, not unique. One would call upon Gaia, one would call upon Hermes, one would again call on Persephone. So, this transition power obviously can be put to any sort of use. Energy, intentionality, creating is a matter of what you wish to do. So to approach such a power that it is inherently demonic or negative is obviously a naive take. An interesting case is where the Chaldean oracles, these texts during the 3rd to the 6th century, quote Hecate, take the name Hecate and make her into this idea of a cosmic soul, something very easily not grasped. So you can see there's a lot of play here, right? A lot's going on here. But for now, we move on to Ptah, which is very undermentioned so far. So some believe that, and this is Egypt, by the way, for concept. Some believed that Ptah was originally a sun god, and some believed that it was originally a moon god, and some others would say that it was both a sun and a moon god. However, none of these also could be the correct choice. Ptah, as time moved forward in ancient Egypt, somehow becomes the creator of the universe. We already mentioned that, Tom. Here's a whole nother story, Ptah. Ptah's words inspired Atum to take on the task, as it's put. The architect of the universe. The deity from whom everything that ever was and ever will be emerged. Ptah, having created the word and the world from the thought in his heart. Sound familiar? Words that gave meaning and shape to all things. Inspiring the creation of the cosmos at the very least. Ptah was said to have fashioned all the good things. Food, justice, labor, the microcosmic, right? Men and the gods and the functions of them, macrocosmic. Said, of course, to sculpt humans from mud and clay, and the gods from precious metals and gemstones. The god whose breath was said to give life to everything. Doesn't sound too far from the Brahmin either. So this central name, right? Like I'm saying, we're talking about Egypt. Ptah, Egypt. Ptah, the land of Ptah. Ptah linked to the city of Memphis. Temple of the soul of Ptah, Egypt. The Greek spelling of the Temple of Memphis derived into the Temple of the Ka of Ptah, House of the Soul of Ptah. As it moves through time, it shrank, and it becomes Egypt. Just missing that last part, right? So this patron, too, on the more superficial level of craftspeople, of masons, inventing masonry. I mean, to build the universe is the greatest build of all. The masons. And of course, as we might know, if you're a follower of the course, the Apis bull is the embodiment of the creator god Ptah. And such would be the inspiration for all the bull slaying, in the ancient past all the way into the modern day, and maybe if you're stretching all the way to modern rodeo. So, without getting into the whole Apis bull thing again, because that has its own talk, Ptah was one of a triad of Memphis. Triad? So you have Ptah, Sekhmet, and Nefertum. So there's another triad that goes along with this kind of creation. Although this isn't the only number of signification, because as we may recall, there was also signification to the number 8, of which was the Ogdod. So this creation myth of Ptah was one that says that he brought the first bit of dry land to emerge from the endless depths of the waters, and that being the endless depths of the waters, Nun, known as the god of the earth, right? To craft it out of something uncraftable. The creator of the physical universe, an artisan, a demiurge, a crafter of things. And all he had to do was feel, right? Think, conceive of the idea in his heart and speak. And thus the things were created. If the craftsman envisions a product, again, visualize it in your mind, a house, right? Visualize it. You're visualizing it. You speak it out. This is what I'm going to do, right? Intention. Call upon other people. Hey, help me with this. Put in the work to get the funds, whatever, the supplies. Creation. The thought in the heart, the feeling, the instinct into the word to create. So it's a physical and an intellectual discussion, right? The word and the mind of God, or the heart, right? The ideas that develop within the heart of whatever being that we're wishing to ascribe such power, or ourselves. So, Sia, who? Heka. So, as is the portrayal, Ptah portrayed as handsome, as very brilliant, as wrapped up in a cloth like a mummy, but the hands are free of the cloth, holding a great staff, a shaved head, a skulled cap, the leader of craftsmen. There's also these cases where Ptah is shown as a dwarf, which is an interesting thing that I can't find much sourcing on, other than that is one of the many manifestations of Ptah. The other one's a bull, which that one's a bit easier to dissect. So it's to say that this embodied Ptah creates Atom and the subsequent Ennead as it comes to be. This thought of the gods is the divine knowledge that leads to the divine utterance that leads to the 9 deities subsequently. As you may know already, the cosmogenic supernatural creation is mirrored by the creation of the world, or the deities that run the most fundamental metaphysical faculties of the universe mirror those that run the political orders in the world. And so you can think of this almost as a fractaling out, that everything as above so below, that everything comes out and it all just kind of replicates downward and downward into different orders. So by this metric as well, if you have the one that created it, then that one who created it would have control over the processes of both life and the afterlife. So the functions of this deity are very open-ended. There's a ceremony given in the name of Ptah of the opening of the mouth, of which is a ceremony given to those that have recently died, that opens their mouth and allows the spirit to eat and drink into the afterlife. This is one of the many things that would have been done to somebody recently deceased. This iron knife placed into the mouth that opens it up, and to reclaim their senses and their experience in the afterlife. While I'm on the subject, we might as well give some of those famous god names that we always love to hear. So you have the Master of Ceremonies, you have the Lord who listens to those prayers, you have the Lord of Eternity, the Divine Sculptor, the Master of Justice, Ptah, who is south of his wall. That's an interesting one. Ptah, who is under the moringa tree. Another interesting one. The Lord of Resurrection. Anything can be fashioned. Anything can be fashioned. Thus, the fashioner of the earth, the Lord of the year. Now, when we take this name, right, Ptah, we get a lot of curious speculation as to where this name comes from and where this name deviates out into. So Ptah could be rooted in Ptah, like Pythagoras. There is this quote, Ptah teo japut. So Ptah tae, Buddha, or therapeutic, Ptah. There's also the far deviation as it's speculated to enter shaman, or Jupater, pater, Egypt, right? Pater, the father, Ptah. Speculative, because if it is to say, not to say that the Egyptian word is the progenitor of all these different words of significance, but it is possibly to say that in the ancient world beyond even Egypt, there was a word that got taken by all these different cultures and deviated. And there is a substantial claim to that. So this lead of talking about Ptah, already with the name Egypt for one, but at the very least, the ones that I feel like really aren't too big of a stretch are Pythagoras, right? Pythagoras and Jupater, Pater. Buddha and the shaman, that would be a fascinating find. And what does Pythagoras do, right? Pythagoras is a healer, dealing with rhythm, vibration. Creation is vibration. Stretch. The knowledge of ancient Egypt was brought by Pythagoras. In the stories of Pythagoras, he was said to have been honored by giving the secret initiations by the Egyptians and returned and taught at his school. So, at the very least, right, this name that could have been taken on could have been this homage to Masonry or Ptah, which is where you start to see the conspiracy lane come in, right? Or the tracked history of Masonry. Look no further than this, I suppose, or look as far as you want. So, without overdoing it, because I have way too much here, I'm going to give a prayer. And that is, quote, "Glory be to you, the noble Djed," which is, the Djed pillar, the fundamental of all things. "For all the years you wrapped me in your light, for the creativity you have given me to better my work. In you alone I seek growth and abundance and peace, the Lord of eternity." So if there are all these other deities to deal with, this is the sort of prayer that would go back to the big boy, so to speak, right? How, if you had all these things to appeal to, who are kind of compartmentalized in their functions of the universe, what would you pray to Ptah for, right? And that is either in the craft, in the life and death, or in this great outlook macrocosmically of your life. So these symbols of Ptah is this Djed pillar, which is also a symbol that represents the spine and is also a reference to why Ptah is involved in the mummification ceremony. The spine as this fundamental kind of staff of one's beingness, which, you could maybe make some like kundalini or snake allegories there as well. The other is the bull, which I don't want to talk about that. Not right now. Or, right, this dwarf. This curious dwarf. This Djed, this fertility pillar, right, as it's also indicative of the genitalia. This pillar as it holds up temples. Fundamentals, right? Fundamentals. Even the architecture is all allegory, right? And even with the Masons, every step that is made to walk up it is counted and is full of intention, much in the same way as any religious ceremony, and much in the same way is the architecture of the ancient Egyptians, to pay homage to the cunningness, the brilliance of the original architect. Why would they be so interested in making these elaborate displays? These perfect angles. Okay. So this ubiquity across the culture, for one, this depiction of this royalty, this originator of the earth and life, depicted with green skin. And this is an interesting reference because when I see green, I think of the doctrine of signatures, and I think of green representing balance. So the balance between all the colors is green. If a plant or the world is healthy, it tends to go green, right? Not beige or what have you. However, there's another interpretation of why Ptah would be green, and that is the act of dying, or the mummification in the underworld, the body taking on a greenness upon decay. That is another idea. I feel a little bit less certain about that. These green skins were, though, often shown with the deities of the afterlife. Osiris was shown to be green, Geb, the god of earth, and Wajd. These colors of green as representing the dead, I think, also could be a reference to moving into the reincarnation of life, in the sense that becoming vegetation, right? Like the man becomes green, becomes a ficus or a sword fern or something to this effect, becomes green. This representation of this greater architecture that moves one towards that resurrection. So now, my last mention of Ptah is that it's a function that a construction, an architecture, a utilization, a concoction, a conjuring, a using, a manipulating of these various elements, these unimaginable powers, right? And superficially speaking, this is carpentry, this is sculpting, this is metalworking, this is the alchemy of the ancient day, right? But also there is the very elements of nature which are sculptable materials, of which is earth, fire, water, air, and ether, if you wish to throw that into the mix. So this building and this construction needs to play on all those levels. Now, we now move on to the Demiurge, okay? So this is even more strongly related than the Heka and Hecate tangent. The Demiurgos, which simply means demos, people, which we see in the word democracy or demographics, people, demos, demi, and ergon, or ergo, which means to work. So literally, one who works for the people, as this word comes to Greek. Artisan, that's what an artisan does, works for the people. So this word, you can see already from its introduction into the etymology of Greek, is already very different than what people associate with the Demiurge. the original creator. And this is an idea that floated around the Greeks, this idea of this original creator, although it didn't only play that function. There is simply the use of the word for the microcosmic. Again, someone who ordains, or somebody who arranges something, or somebody who is an artist and fashions things together. However, there is the greater concept that the person that's putting that together is mirroring the artist that is the macrocosmic artist, right? And this is where we get eventually, as we'll talk about, Plato's ideal forms, right? Who created the forms that humankind emulates? The Demiurgos. So we have Astrophanes saying that this is artisans when he uses this word, and it's simply to the workers, the different craftsmen, the different blue collars, so to speak. And then there's the Demorikos, which is the style, this particular style of those artisans, of those arts, of which case, right, that seems to be hinting towards the greater Demiurge. And then we have the kind of use as it is to talk about the potter, like literally somebody who's molding clay. The evolution of the word moving towards this idea of the cosmic molder, right? Molding the clay. The demiurgos, right? The worker of the people, the worker of the people. In the Timaeus, you see that the demiurge is not just, it is playing this greater cosmic function, right? Is participating mutually in the microcosmic and the macrocosmic crafting. This role of the demiurge as this supreme and even potentially gigantic organism, the different ways that this was talked about by different thinkers is truly has a great breadth to it, has a huge variety. Let's just put it that way. So the term can apply to either world that you're talking about, per se, during this time. Now, when it comes to the word itself, it also has gone through several iterations. And as it's used here, it says the demiurge who is termed the maker and the father. So maker, that's a different take, and that is poetes que pater, which is the poetess. Potes. Does that sound familiar? And pater, Egypt, Jupater, father. This poetess part, maker. What is the etymology of the word poet? Greek, poetes, maker, author, poet. To make, to create, to compose. The maker, one who piles up, one who builds, one who makes. How does one make? They get the idea in the heart and they speak. And now we have the word poet, the poet and the father, the crafter and the father, the maker, the molder, the pater, the potter. You see? You see? Okay. The most perfect of causes is another quote. The most beautiful of generated beings. Again, if we're tying poetry into this mix, now it's taking on a very different flavor, which how very Greek of them, right? That inspires, it inspires the eternal creation, but in itself is uniform and ungenerated. So it's difficult to know anything of this initial demiurge as it is being kind of flushed out in the minds of the Greeks, and especially by Plato and the Timaeus. This idea, though, lends itself to this concept of beneficence, that this tremendous creator, this tremendous maker, this tremendous craftsman, this artist out there, right, that makes the fractals of the ice, in the winter's night, right? Like this beauty of the world that is self-created, that we can observe next to any time. This artist, right? And thought of as beneficent, miraculous, and good without anything else. that the imperfections of the world are of anything, in some conceptions, that its attentiveness is limited, you see. So like if there is a substance, right, that you can work with, you can only do so much at a time. So, you're endlessly going to work on this material and trying to make it right, but the material is unruly. So there's that of the limitations of the material that the creator is working with is a concept that was being floated around. What were the circumstances of the original condition is another question that was thrown around. This righteousness of the creator, though, was in this initial conception. Now, the Orphics play an interesting role in this kind of discourse into evil for this demiurgos, this demiurge concept. That this return to the Platonic forms, the Platonic ideals, started to take on a different flavor, dedicated to all the laws in order and subsequent times of innocence of the evil. And to each of them, the demiurge is innocent of moral evil. The lower gods is where the evil reigns. Then you get to Numenius, and all of a sudden this pessimism really starts to move in, that evil must be in the case of, or potentially within the grasp of, the demiurgos, or is named the second god. So the crafter as an idea of a second god, implying that there's one other that is supreme and inactive, and that the evil one is showing up, right? And that's the one that's really doing the crafting. And then all of a sudden, you have this very conflated story that moves into how the Gnostics got their idea. Because it's Neoplatonism, it's Gnosticism, and Gnosticism, for those that don't know, really is taking handfuls from Greek, like the greater Greek, not just intellectual sphere, but also its mythological sphere. I mean, as we went through the Greek cosmology, we took note of Tartarus in their cosmogony. There's also explanations for the gods within. And this ultimately can lend itself towards the doctrine of demonic signatures, the doctrine of demonic imitation, that of which all the gods were created by the demiurgos, the evil one, and thus they are illusions, you see. So this is a real spin. Like, when did this pessimism enter exactly is something that's hard for me to track without giving another month of research. Oh boy. That which one holds the spirit in bondage, that the soul being made of clay is an unfit cage for the pneuma, or for the spirit. And in this case, you could see that the Orphics really had this in their own camp as well. It was when it was Dionysus and the bodies of the Titans. The heart of Dionysus surviving in man, giving man divinity, but the unholiness of the bodies of the Titans, of which he is substantiated. It's really a one-to-one translation. And all of a sudden you see that the name of this demiurge is instead Soklas, which is meaning the foolish one. And depending on what literature you're looking at, variates on what this demiurge means. Because are we talking about the Manichaeans? Are we talking about the Mandeans? Are we talking about the Valentinians? Are we talking about the Cathars? Because they all have their own way about this. This Isle de Both, or Beoth, is usually the one that captures the most kind of heinous, sinister energy, this demiurge of psychic non-spiritualness that's a kind of blind god, which is all great fodder for what would come to inspire H.P. Lovecraft's cosmic horror. I mean, this is where it's at. It's all here in Gnosticism of what was done with the Demiurge, depicted as lion-headed, snake-bodied. And the snake-bodied, I would think, is time, a representation of time, and the lion's head as it would represent kind of uh, compulsion, like unreflective compulsion, just blind action without reflection and without a heart of consequence. So this voracious, unruly, unintellectual lion's head on a slithering serpent's body as this allegorical, chimeric representation of what this Ptah, right, this benevolent creator, became. And we see how true this really is when we look at the Mandeans and we see their word for this, which is Patahil. And that is simply the Egyptian Ptah and the creator deity El. So Ptah-il, you see? And that it's like right there, so plain to see. The Demiurge, the creator that made from darkness all the things of the powers of the light and the true God. The Demiurge as it stands in contrast to that true God, I mean. So there is the one that created the material world, right? And thinking of a distinction between one God or Demiurge that created all physical manifestation, that one which is evil. And then this other technical Demiurge, creator, crafter, that was the good one that created divinity, and that these are bifurcated, these are dual, right? Split, which is really a taken from the Zoroastrian way of thinking, that this world is so polarized, that the fundamental nature of the cosmos and all of creation is so polarized. So I guess you could see that this beneficence, as it was originally thought of in this idea of the Demiurge, as it entered from Ptah into Egyptian or into Greek polytheism, may have become intermixed with ideas from Zoroastrianism that kind of created this rift. And this is also a great observation of how ideas age, right? Like none of these things are set. They change. The idea of what these things mean change, which I think is a great morale to all this. The last thing I want to say about the Demiurge is I want to look at John 5:19, and it simply says, "We know that we are God's children, and that the whole world lies under the power of the evil one." And what? That's in the Bible. And, of course, in that reflection, then it makes you think Santonos, right? But the way it's worded really gives way to this concept as it was very strongly of the Demiurgos, the Demiurge. So, to get back on this summarization, because I should be done, notice, reflect with me, this magic idea as it was Heka, right? This force beyond creation that ultimately becomes Hecate, which almost pigeonholes it into simply being witchcraft, right? Or underworld, which seems a bit unfortunate, and I'm not dogging on it at all. I love Hecate. And that liminal spaces aspect, that's so powerful. But I think as we categorize these deities, especially with the Greek, they get a bit too narrow in comparison to either A, what they were inspired by, or B, what was genuinely known by the people at the time of their own worship, the historicity of it. But there's also this observation that I was hinting at before about observing how these things change, right? Even the words, even if Ptah does go to shaman, even if Ptah does go to Buddha, notice if we entertain that these things are true, notice how much the change is. These ideas, these words, these deities, these concepts of great signification, of great nuance, of great storytelling, mind you, it's very fascinating. We change the story. And it might be that the idea of it is always still centrally there, and we kind of get away from it, and then we kind of come back to it in a different way. We might give a different word for it. But, to think of any of these one concepts, right, as utterly fixed is not accurate. That's not the nature of the world. We can hypothesize about a kind of externalized objectivity to what these stories are trying to feel out, like the blind man with the elephant, sure. But in this day-to-day concept, like, what do these things mean as we look at these different stories and different characters from mythology and whatever? It means what we want them to mean. Really. Because, look what they did with the Demiurge. Look at that transition as it was made. We get what we want to see, right? If we want a polarized universe, we create a polarized universe, right? If we want it to be pessimistic and that we need to escape this body of flesh, we can have that. And if we want it all to be a creation of beauty and this, pleromic fractalization of this ideal, right? And like truly beneficent, we can have that. But also a note for like just the future of the study. This Sia who Heka, this thought in the heart that leads to a word, that leads to the building of things, that is really, I feel like, the cherry, the crux, the just crumb of gold that's in the center of these creation stories that like at the beginning was the word. That's where it's at. That's where it's coming from. That is what's being undermentioned in that kind of trope of these different stories. So yes, that was a journey. Yes, I got a little heated. I hope you have some really good leads to take away from that. And I hope it wasn't too hard to get through all of my fumbling.